From lyrics designed to hide God to music designed to hide the lyrics, worship music has begun to fail Christians. But at the end of the day, the true question is, what is the point of worship? I've been a worship musician for the last 20 years, and I've studied the Bible for the last 27 years. This is where I've seen the decline of worship over time. Lyrics are failing in worship of God. Now, this is not to go super theological on what is worship yet. We will get into that. But first and foremost, when you have lyrics in worship that purposely hide the person of God within it, and even more so, if you can take those same songs, the same lyrics in there, and just eliminate the word God and sing it in any other context, if it works and it functions and it sounds like a love song, or it sounds like something that you would hear naturally anywhere else, you haven't designed a song that worships God. You've designed a song that has good lyrics. And there's nothing wrong with having good lyrics. That's a wonderful thing. But good lyrics without the substance of what worship is fails the Christian church, and it leads us to teach a bad theology of worship. A theology of worship is our ability to understand how to worship God from a biblical point of view. This has nothing to do with music or styles or anything like that. It's just a question of what is worship to God? And the first thing that needs to be focused on is the lyrics that we sing within our worship songs. Are we singing songs that truly worship God? Yes or no? And what I'm finding a lot of times is it's getting harder and harder to find songs that actually worship God. Songs that don't focus on other aspects of our relationship, that don't focus on the us and anything, but that actually do focus on who God is. A simple way to see that is to ask the question, what is the point of the lyrics of this song? If the point of a song is for you, look what God has done for me, look at everything that I get, look at the benefits that I'm receiving from God, then at no point are you singing worship to God. You're just singing about the benefits of being a Christian. And that's a wonderful thing. We have great benefits as believers, and we should enjoy the things that God has given us. And I encourage Christians to seek those things and to enjoy the love of God in our life. But when we go to worship, there should be a focus not on the I, but on the He, a focus on who God is and what God does. And so the first point is lyrics are failing us. The second point comes from a musician's point of view. That is, music is purposely designed to create an emotional response to hide the lyrics from us. There are many times where I've been in worship services where, to be quite honest, nobody knows what the lyrics are. They sing the words. We all sing it together. We join in worship together. But at the end of the service, did those words actually mean anything to us? Or did we feel something? And a lot of times the feeling of something is coming from the way the music is played. Musicians that know when to stop, when to build up, how to build up. A lot of the emotions that come from music come from the musicians themselves and the techniques that they're employing to do the best with worship. And so many times what you're going to see is that a musician is what makes the worship service much better in terms of the response from the people. They will bring the emotion that comes in it. And so the way that the music is played, the way that the music is designed, quite naturally causes an emotional response within people. And this emotional response that we have can come from any other lyrics, because it's not the lyrics driving the response, it's the music driving the response. And this is something I can say with the confidence of a seasoned musician that's played in every type of environment that you can think of, whether it's a large concert venue, whether it's at the local church, whether it's a small church or a big church. All of that experience I have has shown me that the way that the music is played and the technique that we have will create more of a response in people more often than not than the lyrics that we're singing. When you have lyrics that can be easily seen to worship man instead of worshiping God, but they're covered in this sphere of wonderful music, music that creates that emotional response within all of us, then it is a lot harder to focus on what the lyrics are saying, and you focus more on the response you get from the music. Now, this is not something new. Music has always been designed to create a response emotionally from people. When you look at early forms of worship within the church, what you're looking at is people who were creating music designed with a purpose. So early on, they used to do what's called a unison voice, which is where people would sing and or chant in the same exact tone, frequency, pitch, whatever you want to call it. Everybody just sang at the same pitch. And this was to create the idea that we are united in worship. And so it creates that feeling that there is unity in our worship. When we move to larger cathedrals and the church begins to get larger, and we want to create a more varied response, we see the emergence of chords within music, where people will sing different notes at the same time, creating that style where the room is just filled with the voices, and every voice is slightly different. Maybe one is an octave higher, one is an octave lower. And so it creates an emotional response in people, especially in a cathedral-like setting where there's a lot of reverb and a lot of bouncing of sounds from the walls. So it's not a new thing that worship music elicits a response. It is normal for musicians to design music with a purpose in mind, with a response in mind, and so we create these styles. But this then leads to the third issue that I have with worship music, and one of the things that worship music has been getting wrong. And it ties into my fourth point as well, so I'll bring these together. The third point is worship music limits musicians, and the fourth point is worship music is focused on the congregation's response. Let's start with point number 3. Worship music limits musicians. That is something that I didn't understand when I first started playing at 13, 14 years old. I gave my best every single Sunday, learning the instruments that I was learning to master, practicing as often as I could. I found myself spending hours of my time at home learning how to play the instruments, learning how to perfect them, learning how to play in a band, just doing everything I could to be the best musician I could be. And so every Sunday I was giving my absolute best and pushing myself to the absolute limit until I got to a point where I outpaced the music I was playing. When you outpace the music that you're playing, what you're ending up in is a situation where you're on autopilot. You are just playing what needs to be played. It doesn't take much energy, much effort, much anything really to get through it. I've had Sundays where I have been coughing up a storm, barely able to breathe. My lungs feel like they're on fire, but I could still play that song without any issues at all. It's just muscle memory at that point. It's not pushing me to really play very advanced or very difficult. Now, you might be wondering, well, why don't you just play better on Sundays? Why don't you give more of yourself when you play? And that's where issue number 4 comes in, where we focus on the congregation's response more so than anything else. If I play too aggressively or give better of myself, it can come at the expense of the congregation. And when that happens, what I'm doing is deciding to put the congregation first above my best in worship to God. Now, this is a form of worship where I am not being a distraction to the congregation. I'm not working against the congregation. I am joining them in worship. But I always have to remember that my worship is limited in a congregational sense because I can't give the best of myself. So when we look at focusing on the congregation, it means that while I'm playing, I can't go into an irregular time signature on the drums. I have to do what's called backbeat fills. Fills that will end up exactly where they should end, so that people will naturally keep the cadence and rhythm of clapping. And that's a skill in and of itself. It's a form of musicianship that requires a lot of training and practice and time. And you could argue that every musician must fill the needs of the band. If I'm a drummer, the most important thing is timing. If you're a bass player, the most important thing is the groove. If you're a piano player, the most important thing is the melody. When you have so much more to give as a musician, and you limit yourself, you never truly feel that you're giving your best to God, even if you have great reasons to do so. And so musicians end up finding themselves in situations where their worship as musicians must occur separated from congregational worship. And in a sense, that saddens me. That makes me feel like we are failing, because you will never ask a preacher or a pastor or a teacher, don't give your best. Give only 40% of yourself, Because if you go to 100% and you give your absolute best, then you might be a distraction for the congregation. Musicians are the ones that take the hit in that type of environment. And even if that's okay because we don't have a choice, I still feel that we are failing our musicians in allowing them to be free in worship, and there must be some type of solution. This fourth point, though, is really one of those things that as I get to know God more, it begins to hurt me more. It begins to affect me negatively more. When we talk about the fact that we put the congregation over God in worship, what we're saying is that we allow the congregation to determine the quality of our worship. I have seen this many times. When the congregation has an emotional response to worship, it is considered that we had a good day of worship. Even if the songs that we sing do not worship God at all or in any way, even if the songs that we sing are probably the worst ones we can do, even if as a musician you feel like you've done the worst that you've ever done, when the congregation has that emotional response, they immediately assume that the worship was good, that God was glorified, that God was lifted up because we had this reaction. There are going to be days as well where, as a musician, as someone who's worshiping, you're singing those songs that glorify God, and you give so much more of yourself that day, and then the congregation doesn't react, and the assumption then is we had a bad day of worship. And so the level of worship, the quality of worship that we have doesn't always get judged by how well did we glorify God or how well did we speak the truth of God. It comes to how well did people react to what we were doing. And I just find that to be such a dangerous precedent to set, because if our worship is to glorify God, to put him up in the highest place, and the metric for it is how people respond to what you do, you will always be at the mercy of people and not at the mercy of God. And that's just wild to me as a Christian. That just doesn't make sense. As a group, as a congregation, when we sit down to worship God, there has to be some type of distinction between where you measure good worship versus bad worship. Worship that works and worship that doesn't work. Worship that is failing and worship that is succeeding. So now the main question, the reality of why we are here. What is the reason which we get up to worship God? And even more importantly, how do we measure if our worship is righteous before God? I want to start with just what scripture says about worship. Let me start with Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. I wanted to start with Romans for one particular reason. I think this is a good generalization of what most of the New Testament talks about when it comes to worship. When we're looking at New Testament worship, what we're seeing is not just the words that we say, but the life that we live, how we renew our minds and go away from our old selves, how we die to ourselves daily, and how we separate ourselves and become acceptable to God in the way that we live. So a good example of Christian worship within the New Testament is the lifestyle that we live that gives honor and glory to God. Now, can you make this then the norm for how we do things in a church worship service? Probably not. When you go to a worship service and you play worship music, this is not how you live your life every day. But what we can say is, if we are becoming a living sacrifice, if we are giving away of ourselves and focusing on renewing our minds, then the lyrics that we have, the worship that we give to God, changes from lyrics that focus on us to lyrics that focus on God. Because we're going away. We're disappearing in this whole act. We give ourselves daily as a living sacrifice. That means we die. We renew our minds. That means that what I thought yesterday, what I thought this morning, I'm going to put that away and allow my mind to be renewed by the Holy Spirit so that I can focus not on me, but on God. Let's go to Psalms 29:2. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. The Psalms tell us to recognize God as he is. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Holiness is one of those words that a lot of people like to make super spiritual. When you look at holiness in the root of what it means and what it's trying to portray, it's the separateness of God. When we're ascribing the separateness of God, we're describing the things that make God different from us, that make God unique. So phrases like, God, you are the creator of heaven and earth. That is an act of ascribing holiness to God. When you talk about the attributes of God, you bring it even a step higher. So you can talk about God being a protector, God being the one who leads us from evil, absolutely. But more importantly, we need to talk about all the things that make God not just like any other God, but a separate God. When we talk of God as a protector, we are showing who he is and the glory of his splendor. But that's not the only attribute that God has. We can bring so much more out of that. There's so much. God, you are an infinite God. You have no beginning. God, you are a Trinitarian God. You are a God of holiness. There is none like you. God, you are everywhere and at all points in time. God, you are every when. There is no time in which you are not. God, you are so much grander than my eyes can realize, than the depths of my soul can understand. The psalmist is asking us to revel in the fullness of the splendor of God. Not that I was worthy to be saved, but man, how great this God that we serve is because of who he is. And when we sing songs like, How Great Are You, Lord? How Great Is My God? They are beautiful songs, yes. Why is my God great? What makes him great? These are things that I like to give back to God in worship. I like to remind God, not because he needs me to remind him, but because I need to remind me. I worship God in the splendor of his glory. And then finishing it off with Hebrews 12:28. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. I think Hebrews does a great job of giving us a synopsis of how to bring worship. It begins with the concept of gratefulness. Let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And thus, let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. There is worship that is acceptable to God, and there is worship that is not acceptable to God. When you look at the core of what worship means, service is a part of the core word. It has many different forms of how to ascribe worship or to say worship. But one of the forms of worship that we have is a form of service, which is why we have Paul saying that we present our bodies as a living sacrifice as a form of spiritual worship. So there is more to worship than just the words that we say. There's also the actions that we take in worship. So there is acceptable worship before God and unacceptable worship before God. And so when we start with gratefulness to God, that brings us into a point where we can bring acceptable worship to God. Gratefulness, not just for the sacrifice that he gave on the cross, but for who he is. And then the core aspect that really brings us out is the reverence and awe associated with it. Reverence is one of those things that's hard to give nowadays. Awe is easier, but I think we misuse it as well because a lot of people use the phrase awesome or amazing. And so we use it for every aspect of our lives. When my daughter does good in her math homework, awesome job. I'm proud of you. And that's good because I do lift her up in that. But does the word awesome for her mean the same as awesome for God? When we talk about awesome with God, we're saying that the awe that we have when we look at God is so great that we can't help but to back away and to just really revere who he is. You'll see in some verses in the Old Testament and the New Testament that we come before God and worship with fear and trembling because he is much greater than what we are. So it's not to say that we should be afraid of God, but it does mean that we should look at God and truly, truly recognize that he is just that. He is God. He is not my friend for me to worship him as a friend. And what I mean by that is I can tell a friend he did great. I do this all the time. Look at all that you've done. You've gone through this situation, through that situation. You've given your best. You've been praying. You've been glorifying God. You did an amazing job, and I'm proud of you. That is a form of worship that I'm giving to my friend. I am listing out what he's done. I'm listing it in a way that describes his actions, and I'm doing it with the intent to lift him up in a particular way. Now, is it the same worship I give God? No, but we can't treat God and our worship in the same way. There should be a reverence for God, an awe of God when we worship him, where it's just, this is God. It should bring such excitement not to hear the music, but to say, this is my God. This is who I am worshiping. Look at what he's done in all of history. Look what he's done in scripture. Look how he's acted, not just in my life, but everywhere. Look at who God is. And if you look at that God, you can't help but fall down and worship him with the fullness of what that is. So, what is worship? Worship is reverent acknowledgement of God. It is a life that lives in that reverence. We do because God has done. And God has done because God is who he is. And that is beautiful. Worship must be done with a proper awe of who God is and with proper reverence to God. When we say that God created the heavens and the earth, this is not something that should make us feel normal. It shouldn't be just a phrase that we say. A lot of times as we get to know God more and study God more, we can become complacent with, well, of course God did that. He's God. And that's something that I had to learn to fear in myself. This whole ideology and this whole philosophy of, well, that's just who God is. It's more than it, that's just who God is. It's, oh my goodness, that is God. What would it mean for God to create the heavens and the earth? What does it mean that God is infinite? This should give me reverence and awe of him. And even more so, even if it sounds as if I'm saying emotions are bad in worship, I don't believe that. I believe we should have an emotional response in worship, but I believe that the emotional response should come from a revelation of God and who he is, where we begin to acknowledge, oh my goodness, my God is a God that is not bound by time. When I say that God knew everything that was going to happen, that means he knew everything. He knew everything that I was going to fail at, and every sin that I would commit, and every time that I would fail him, whether it's as a Christian or a non believer. God knew all of that before I was even created, before I was even born. Before I existed in this world, God knew that. And he also knew everything that would come after and all the things that he's protected me from and saved me from. We serve a God so unbound by time that it is amazing to even think of that. And that creates an emotional response in you so great that you feel who God is. You feel the love that he has by the nature of who he is. And so it's wonderful to acknowledge and feel the revelation of God in your life as a form of worship. Worship should create an emotional response. Absolutely. But that emotional response should come as a result of who God is and not as a result of how good the music was. Worship must keep the holiness of God. And what that means is that we should separate God in our worship. We should not bring God down to our level. We should not ascribe to God that which belongs to man. We need to keep God as God in worship. And that is a very difficult thing to do at times because it's very difficult to understand fully who God is because God is greater than us. It's how it should be. Let's be honest. If God was not greater than me, then I could not serve my God. If I can learn everything about who God is and know God perfectly and the fullness of what it means to be God, that means I know what it means to be infinite. I know what it means to be everything and every attribute of God. I can understand all powerfulness perfectly. I can understand all knowledge perfectly. And saying that would be ridiculous. No one would believe me. It's difficult for me to even say those words, even in joking or in as an example, because it's a level of intellectual arrogance that people just cannot accept. If you say your God is so great, but you know everything of God, then you are equal to or greater than God in one attribute at the minimum. And that attribute would be knowledge. And so no one can say they truly know everything about God. And so we should treat him as holy. We should treat him as greater than us in every way possible because he is greater than us in every way possible. And that's a blessed thing. And if you keep those things in mind, the wrappings around it, the music, the way the music is played, all these things just become ways in which to help you in your worship of God, or ways in which you can express your worship of God. So there's nothing wrong with music in worship. But the biggest problem I see and where we get worship wrong is when we try to circumvent God with our worship. We see worship as what we give to God, when worship is what is demanded of God by us. We add no value to God in our worship. And that is a weird thing to say, but let's say you don't acknowledge that God created the world. Does that mean he less created the world or that he's lesser than because you didn't say it? He still created the world whether you acknowledge it with your words or not. He doesn't require you to be God. So worship is not a requirement for God to be God, but it is an acknowledgement of one who deserves to be acknowledged. As believers, when we go to worship God, we are making a conscious decision to honor who God is through our words, through our actions, through our lyrics, through the music. We are giving the best of ourselves to God because he's God. As a musician, why do I want to play my best in worship? I want to play my best because God deserves the best of who I am, because he is always the best. And for me to give just a fraction of myself just doesn't feel like I'm worshiping God with the reverence that he deserves. Giving my best in worship is an act of reverence before God, saying, God, you are so much greater than me. Here is the best of me in worship. Worshiping God in truth is saying that when I say these lyrics, they're about everything that you are. Worshiping God in awe is saying, God, in this music that I'm playing, in this worship that I'm giving, in this lyrics that I'm acknowledging, I recognize who you are to be greater than who I am. And I thank you for that. So worship isn't difficult, but when we use the metric of how people respond to worship, then we are failing God with our worship, because then the point of worship has moved away from acknowledgement to God to acknowledgement from people. So one of the things that I have learned is that I will never judge my worship in accordance to how people react. I judge my worship in accordance with who I am before God and how I'm worshiping God. And I can tell you with full honesty, I've had worship services where I know that my heart, my intentions, and my acknowledgement of God are absolutely wrong, and people still react so well, and they probably worshiped great before God, but I didn't. I did not honor God the way that he needed to be honored, and I have been ashamed of myself in those worship services. Like immediately getting out of that, I just felt, God, I didn't do right by you. I didn't revere you. I wasn't in awe of you today. I didn't acknowledge who you were. I was so focused on how frustrated I was because I didn't do something right or something happened right before worship. So worship cannot be judged by how people react, because in those instances, if the church is in awe or enamored before God, and everyone says it's a wonderful worship service and look how well God moved, and I'm going to sway my heart and my mind, and I'm not dying to myself. I'm allowing myself to live a life that doesn't worship God, and I just can't do that and say that I'm honoring God as He should. I can't say that and say that I kept Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I can't have a service like that, look back and accept that I scripturally worship God. So I encourage you guys, think this through, come to your own conclusions. But more importantly, I encourage you guys, if you've not worshiped God in this way and of acknowledgement of who He is and acknowledgement of His awe and His glory, you give it a shot because it'll transform your life. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like the content that we're making, feel free to subscribe. God bless and have a great day.